Li Xuanxuan donned an ancient and early male fantasy novel and became the fiancé of the male lead who married him through fingertips. In the text, the male protagonist, who was originally the proud son of heaven, fell into a low point due to his cultivation being abolished. After experiencing 3 or 5 setbacks, he became the first person in the cultivation world. Unfortunately, this article is outdated. Divorce flow. Shuangwen. Li's fiancé Xuanxuan. For the sake of freedom, Li Xuanxuan bravely walked away from the plot of divorce. However, after retiring, Li Xuanxuan realized that there seemed to be something wrong with the male lead. Xuanxuan, who came from a mortal family and was a member of a prestigious and upright sect, has an outstanding appearance, extremely high talent, a gentle and introverted personality, and a humble and courteous demeanor, just like a legitimate immortal young master. This can be considered a perfect life, but there is one flaw, which is that he has a fiancée who is physically weak and unable to cultivate immortality. At the low point of Xuanxuan's life, his fiancée unexpectedly demanded that he voluntarily withdraw his marriage. When we met again, Xuanxuan noticed that there seemed to be something wrong with his fiancée PS1. Introduction is invalid. Welcome to open the main text and take a look too. Recommended peach. The end of the fast-wearing article, a bright future in wearing books modern romance article, after wearing 2 books, I and the actor male lead he, 3. Recommend friends who have completed the Star Chronicle keywords of the novel. At first, I only wanted to get out of marriage without a pop-up window. At first, I only wanted to get out of marriage. Download the complete text. At first, I only wanted to get out of marriage. Read the latest chapter. Chapter 1. Wearing books. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1 Wearing books, Masterly, are you really going to terminate the engagement between the 2 families? A cold male voice sounded, as if with a ding sound, pulling Li Xuanxuan out of her chaotic state. She looked up in confusion. In the field of vision is the living room for a while, with a middle-aged man sitting on his right side, and 3 men across from him, one of whom instantly grabs her attention. The other party was dressed in white, with a simple bundle of ink hair. Although sitting in a wheelchair, their demeanor was completely devoid of dust, and they seemed to have their own radiance, making their surroundings even darker. Just one glance is enough to hold one's breath. What a fairy-like man. Even if he lowers his head and lowers his eyes, even if he only shows half of his face, it cannot stop the fact that it is a ceiling. Although the immortal man would no longer speak, Li Xuanxuan's intuition was that the clear and beautiful voice that awakened her came from his throat. Before Li Xuanxuan could make any movement, a few sizzling sounds of electricity suddenly echoed in her mind, accompanied by a cold mechanical sound. Congratulations, you have successfully bound the colorless scrap correction system, and this system 717 will do its best to serve you. Welcome to join the correction team. Now I will explain the detailed situation to you. This world is a cultivation text. 3 years ago, the sect where the male protagonist Xuanxuan belongs was brutally slaughtered by a mysterious person. The male protagonist, who was originally the proud son of heaven, was also deposed due to his cultivation and could only return to his secular home for cultivation. Fortunately, the male lead has exceptional talent. Keep striving for self-improvement. Never give up. He changed his useless physique, broke through the character of a disaster star, obtained the secret script of not dying from falling off a cliff, and passed it on by entering a secret realm. He continued to cheat and improve his cultivation, not only identifying mysterious people and restoring his sect, but also becoming the first person in the cultivation world, with 3,000 beauties. I don't know if it was Li Xuanxuan's illusion, but she felt the originally flat system sound becoming more passionate. But the next second, the system calmly said. And your name is Li Xuanxuan, the fiancé who married the male lead Xuanxuan through fingertips. She insulted him because she despised him for becoming a useless person, and even ordered him to voluntarily withdraw from the marriage. After experiencing this, the male protagonist lost face and decided to embark on the path of cultivating immortality again. He swore that one day he would wash away the shame of today. 3 years later, the male lead will reach the pinnacle of this cultivation world. Although Li Xianxian has been listening to the system, she has not completely ignored the external voices. At this moment, the cold male voice rang out again. Master Li, if you want Xia to voluntarily terminate the engagement, it's not impossible. However, Xia wants to ask, does Mr. Li also know about this matter? Sitting in the main seat, Li Guangping, the head of the Li family, waved his sleeve upon hearing the words and spoke with a cheerful expression, just agree with nephew Xia. My old man has been traveling abroad for over a year now, and everything in the family is under the control of me, Li. Xuanxuan's mouth curved with a smile, not a smile. Oh. He lowered his gaze and straightened his sleeve. The engagement between the Xia and Li families was determined by 2 old men. Now that Mr. Li is unaware, my grandfather has already passed away. Xuanxuan dare not desecrate his elders, only afraid of the matter of divorce. Xuanxuan looked up at Li Guangping and said, please forgive me for not being able to agree. Li Guangping frowned slightly upon seeing the situation. If the Li family can withdraw on their own, why bother dragging on for 3 years? He originally thought that Xuanxuan, after experiencing various hardships, should have been in a state of decadence and lethargy. Moreover, the other party should have personally come to his door, and he thought he had already surrendered. Unexpectedly, Xuanxuan was so difficult to deal with. While Li Guangping was startled, there was also a hint of excitement. The more difficult Xuanxuan is to deal with, the more extraordinary his achievements in front of the Qin family will become. Li Guangping sighed and said with some seriousness, my nephew, it's not that Uncle Shi intentionally poked your wound. You've been sitting in this wheelchair for 3 years now, and you need the help of servants for clothing, food, housing, and transportation. How can I trust you to hand over Xianxian? In 100 years' time, with what kind of face can I meet Xuanxuan's parents? Xuanxuan suppressed Mr. Xia, and Li Guangping suppressed Li Xuanxuan's parents. Anyway, they were all dead people, and it's not necessarily who is more noble than anyone else. Xuanxuan's face remained unchanged as he said, when I was still studying in the mountains, my family once wrote a letter saying that your government wanted to replace the marriage partner with Miss Air. As soon as Xuanxuan finished speaking, Li Guangping hurriedly hummed and denied, is there such a thing? How could I not know? It must be a rumor. Xuanxuan's lips curved slightly, but there was a hint of mockery. Oh. At this moment, Li Guangping's face instantly became extremely gloomy. The 2 of them had their eyes facing each other, as if there were swords and shadows surging. On the other hand, the introduction of the system has come to an end. The male protagonist, who has become the ruler of the world and boasts 3,000 beauties, still remembers you as a snobbish former fiancé AE who will take you as a slave and bully you day and night. The host's task is to maintain the character and complete the original storyline. Li Xianxian raised her eyebrows and said, bullying day and night. 717 System puzzled. Are these 4 words difficult to understand? It's just to make you watch him wield immense power, but not give him a penny, making you envy him day and night, please him, and regret what you did back then. Li Xianxian blinked and said, don't touch me. The male lead doesn't hit women. Li Xianxian remained silent for a moment and asked straightforwardly, will you have a sore relationship with me? No way. What would happen if I refused the task? Li Xianxian asked again. Foreign souls, not embraced by the heavenly way, destroy all human souls. Li Xianxian. That is to say, she only has one option. Externally, facing Xuanxuan's lack of salt and oil, Li Guangping was annoyed and restless. His gaze shifted to his niece next to him, and his eyes couldn't help but brighten. Later, he returned to his calm elder demeanor. Thank you, nephew. After all, our Li family is still a prestigious family and has always admired freedom. Why don't we listen to Xuanxuan's own thoughts? As Li Guanping's words fell, the audience's gaze also shifted to Li Xianxian. Ding, congratulations to the host for triggering the mission. Please complete the task of humiliating the male lead and withdrawing from his marriage as soon as possible, Li Xianxian. Facing everyone's gaze, Li Xianxian appeared timid and lowered her head to avoid, but in fact, she secretly negotiated with the system in a friendly manner. After all, after completing this task, she didn't benefit much. How could there be no benefits? After completing the task, the host can survive in this world. What is the difference between living and dying when the male lead is confined by his side for a lifetime? Li Xianxian remained unmoved. After completing all the plot, 717 can assist the host in feigning death and escaping. This sounds quite similar. The original owner, as the cannon fodder in the early stages, has no role in the story except for the beginning of the divorce and the ending of being a slave. That is to say, after completing this task, she can be carefree for 3 years. After 3 years, she can execute the task again, and then worry-free for a lifetime. After thinking, Li Xianxian stood up and turned to the position where Xuanxuan was. With a light chin, her eyes were fixed on the transparent screen in front of her, and she said loudly, "Since it's our engagement, what does it matter to others? The new book has been released. Please collect it and get recommended tickets. P.S. What is the matter with the 3,000 beauties Guan Xuanxuan in the original work? He only took 1 ladle. This article 1v1, end of this chapter. Chapter 2. Follow the plot. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2. Follow the plot. Is this trying to justify her elders? Li Xianxian pondered in her heart, but without hesitation, she said, "You may have been the proud son of heaven in the past, but now you are not even as good as an ordinary person. To put it bluntly, he is an incompetent person who can only rely on his family and others. He is even more of a useless person who cannot stand up. How can you be worthy of me like this?" It's quite tough on the male lead. However, she is now the original owner, and in the eyes of others, Li Xianxian is also her. Since she has accepted the body of the original owner, she should also bear the consequences together. After adjusting her mindset, Li Xianxian looked directly at Xuanxuan for the first time. Compared to the perfect side profile brought by his distinct skeletal lines, Xuanxuan's front face is also exquisite and flawless, with prominent eyebrows and nose bones, combined with dense eyebrows and deep eyes, making it a sword eyebrow star. After listening to Li Xuanxuan's humiliating words, although his face did not show, there was already a hint of displeasure between his eyebrows and eyes. Not to mention the anger on the faces of the 2 servants beside him. Li Xianxian sighed to herself. However, in the next moment, she still looked Xuanxuan in the face and said, "I believe you are also aware of the gap between us, so let's get married." Xuanxuan is no longer so indifferent to Li Xianxian. He didn't say anything else, just stared at Li Xianxian and asked straightforwardly, "Are you so certain that I won't be able to turn over in the future?" Li Xuanxuan's eyelashes twitched slightly, and although she paused for a moment, she still coldly replied, "That's right." After looking at her for a while, Xuanxuan lowered his eyes. "Okay. That's as you wish. I hope you won't regret it in the future." The last sentence, spoken by Xuanxuan in a very low voice, was not heard by anyone else, not to mention Li Xianxian, whose mind had already been playing with the system. Congratulations to the host for completing 90% of the task. In order to complete the task satisfactorily, please say your lines as soon as possible. If you can turn over, I, Li Xianxian, will be a slave and a servant, and it is up to you the final say. Li Xianxian. This line is really indescribable. It's just that this clearly relates to another task, and it has to be said. Li Xianxian is still struggling, while Xuanxuan has already taken out a small rectangular wooden box from his sleeve. If we want to terminate the engagement, then both parties should return each other's tokens. As Xuanxuan spoke, he withdrew the wooden box and revealed a jade hairpin inside that was transparent and verdant. This is the jade cicada hairpin from your mansion. Please return Xia's orchid jade pendant. After seeing the jade hairpin in the wooden box, Li Xianxian couldn't take her gaze away. Besides its beauty, there was also a little familiarity. Xuanxuan looked up at Li Xianxian. Although he didn't say anything, the urge was still slightly obvious. However, Li Xuanxuan's gaze was stuck on the jade hairpin. Li Guangping, sitting in the main seat, coughed lightly when he saw the situation. Li Xianxian regained her senses from this and couldn't help but blink when she thought of Xuanxuan's words before looking at Li Guangping. Li Guangping felt a bit uneasy and reached into his sleeve, taking out a small square box and handing it to Li Xianxian. Li Xianxian. Isn't the engagement token still with her as the party involved? Taking the small box, Li Xianxian walked straight to Xuanxuan. She handed it over with one hand and was about to go get the jade hairpin with the other, but Xuanxuan withdrew his hand. Li Xianxian was puzzled, but when she saw his gaze fixed on the small box and her head slightly buffered, she immediately understood his meaning. Some are speechless but some are reasonable. So she opened the small box and immediately turned to Xuanxuan. Xuanxuan looked at the jade pendant without any movement for a moment. Li Xianxian immediately handed the small box to the other party, and then eagerly took the jade hairpin box. Due to Li Xuanxuan's somewhat rude movements, her hand accidentally touched Xuanxuan. In that moment, Xuanxuan's eyebrows moved slightly, and a stream of light flashed through his eyes. At this moment, his entire demeanor was suddenly like a cold spring. Just the next second, there was a look of surprise in his eyes, as Li Xuanxuan's voice suddenly rang out in his mind. The hairpin looks good. The sound was not loud and fleeting, as if it were a hallucination. Xuanxuan clearly did not see Li Xianxian speak. Xuanxuan's anomaly was not noticed by Li Xianxian, as all her attention was focused on the hairpin. Looking at this jade hairpin up close, not to mention the transparency of the body, the jade cicada on the hairpin head is even more lifelike. The lines of the entire hairpin are smooth, seemingly simple, but the details are exquisite everywhere. As Li Xianxian became more and more fond of her, Li Guangping at the back coughed again. Li Xianxian didn't turn her head. She pretended to be confused and put away the jade hairpin directly. On the other side, Xuanxuan carefully placed the jade pendant back into his sleeve after seeing it, and then called the servant behind him to turn around and leave, pushing a wheelchair. At this moment, Li Guangping no longer cared about Xuanxuan. He stood up and said, "Xianxian." Li Xianxian turned her head to show a bright smile and said, "Xianxian understands, uncle, rest assured." Li Guangping. What does she understand? What does he rest assured of? Before Li Guangping could think about it again, Li Xianxian had already shouted to Xuanxuan and chased after him. Most likely, it was the first time she was born and the second time she was mature. This time, Li Xianxian stood firm and skillfully put on a haughty young lady's appearance. Xuanxuan, you are also responsible for the divorce matter. I also put my words here today. If you can turn over, I, Li Xianxian, will be a slave and a servant. It's up to you the final say. Xuanxuan couldn't help but snort coldly upon hearing these words. After hearing Xuanxuan's cold snort, Li Xianxian crossed her arms in front of her and followed suit with a snort. Just showing off, who wouldn't? Anyway, this is just one chance for her, so naturally she won't fall behind. Xuanxuan said with a cold and solemn expression, Miss Li must remember what she said. Li Xianxian. Li Guangping hurriedly followed and scolded. Li Xuanxuan's heart twitched and took the opportunity to stomp her feet, so she pretended to shout "Uncle" before turning around and running away. Li Guangping was about to catch up, but Xuanxuan turned his wheelchair and blocked it. What does this mean, nephew Xie? Xuanxuan said with a smile on his face, masterly, good means. Li Guangping couldn't help feeling uncomfortable when he saw Xuanxuan's appearance. What is nephew Xuanxuan saying? Li couldn't understand. Xuanxuan chuckled lightly and said, it doesn't matter if you hear me clearly or not. It's just that the head of the Li family must remember that she is my future maid, Xuanxuan. Li Guangping's face suddenly looked a bit ugly. Xuanxuan didn't care and turned the wheelchair directly. However, before leaving, oh by the way, he tilted his head and said again, now that we have no connection between our families, please don't consider yourself a close friend of the Li family anymore. You. Seeking investment, collecting, and recommending tickets, end of this chapter. Chapter 3. Destroying Good Things. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3 Destroying Good Things. After Xuanxuan finished speaking, the servant pushed the wheelchair out. Li Guangping looked at the backs of the three and was so angry that he jumped up and down, causing one of the servants to turn around and take a glance at him. When the three of them left completely, Li Guangping instantly regained his composure, but his face remained gloomy. The servant in the corner ran forward and Li Guangping immediately asked about Li Xuanxuan's whereabouts. The servant bowed back and said, Miss has returned to the inner courtyard. Li Guangping nodded and said, let's keep an eye on it and don't rush into the nobleman. Also, did someone notify madam? The servant responded repeatedly on the side, I understand. Don't worry, sir. We have already informed you. Miss Eyre will also be with madam this time. After responding with a Li Guangping hurriedly walked towards the other side. And the Li Xianxian they spoke of would be in their own room. Oh no, it's in the original owner's room, packing things. When will we wait if we don't run it this time? Congratulations to the host for successfully completing the task. Li Xianxian gave a hand and said, where's the reward? The reward for the host completing the task is that it will not be erased by the heavenly way. Li Xianxian. Oh. Seemingly worried that Li Xianxian would extort it again, the 717 system immediately silenced and temporarily disappeared. Li Xianxian ignored it and continued to pack up her things. But there's actually nothing to tidy up, just a makeup box and a few clothes, because the original owner hasn't lived here these years, but in a village. Li Xianxian looked at the original owner's makeup box. Apart from a few scattered pieces of jewelry, there were also some small items handed over by the Xie family's messengers. For a moment, she didn't know what kind of reaction to make. Does the original owner have any feelings for Xuanxuan? If not, why are these small objects saved so well? If so, why would she listen to Li Guangping and agree to divorce? The memory she inherited seems to have been lost. But it's not just Li Xianxian, even she seems to be doing the same herself. Li Xianxian shook her head. For the former owner of the Xie family who lost their parents at a young age, there is still some care for them. However, her divorce today has also become an opportunity for Xuanxuan to regain his composure. In this way, it is also mutually beneficial. As for emotional matters, the original owner is no longer there, and it is useless to think too much. Li Xianxian simply packed her luggage into a bundle, picked it up, and then swaggered out of the door. There was someone watching at the main gate of the yard, but without paying attention, Li Xianxian turned to the side door and emerged. Strangely, Li Mansion seems very busy today. Li Xianxian had to take a detour to avoid the servants coming and going. As soon as I walked around, I arrived near the kitchen and also found two servants stealing time in the corner. Brother Wang, is it really okay for us not to go out? Didn't we say that a nobleman came? Hey! You know what the hell? I see that you are a new transfer, Wang. Let me give you a few words of advice. Qin Gongzi, every time he comes over, he only needs young maids to serve by the side. We people, let alone go in, even waiting outside, feel unsightly. It turns out to be the Qin family. This is also the early cannon fodder family mentioned in the article. When the Xia family was just in decline, the Qin family was the first to step forward and make things difficult for them, and year by year they became more and more excessive, even with the influence of the withdrawal of the Xia and Li families. However, as soon as Xuanxuan regained his cultivation, the first venue he found was the Qin family. This is probably the grasshopper after autumn. Li Xianxian turned to approach the kitchen, pressed against the exterior wall, and came to a window where she prepared to walk along some dry food to eat. Coincidentally, the cook placed several steamed dishes on the table by the window and then loudly called for the maid outside to come in and serve the dishes. Li Xuanxuan's eyes turned as she quickly took out a bottle of medicinal powder that the original owner had hidden at the bottom of the makeup box from her bag, sprinkled it on top, and then took away 2 large meat buns on the other side. She then left with her cat body. As soon as Li Xianxian dug out of the Li mansion, at the corner of the alley, Xia San pushed his own master out. Xuanxuan watched as Li Xuanxuan's figure disappeared in the direction, rubbing his right hand against his left, his eyes dim and unclear. Xia San looked at the master in silence and couldn't help but ask, "Master, do you want to chase after him?" Xuanxuan nodded and said, "You go." Xia San immediately shook his head like a tambourine and said, "No way. Li Si hasn't come back yet, how can I leave the master alone?" Xuanxuan, however, refused to listen and turned his wheelchair. He only left with the words, "I'm waiting for you at the inn," before leaving alone. Xia San looked around and around, but finally stomped his feet and chased towards the direction where Li Xianxian had left. Shortly after the 3 of them left, there was a commotion in the Li mansion. But when Li Xianxian left the Li mansion, she walked towards the carriage and horse shop while eating steamed buns. She is going to visit the village where the original owner lived before. The original owner only returned to the Li mansion more than a month ago, so there are not many traces of life here. When she arrives at Zhuangzi, check for any abnormalities, and then pack her luggage and find another place to stay. Li Xianxian, who had made up her mind, naturally headed straight towards her destination, but she never expected that the distance between these 2 places would be so far. She decisively stopped a passerby and asked if there was a shortcut to take. The passersby looked at Li Xianxian with some shock. This kind of gaze is probably looking at a fool who lives in a wealthy area but has no means of transportation. Li Xianxian had to repeat it helplessly. The passerby just pointed to the alley ahead and said a rather complex route. Before Li Xianxian could remember it clearly, the others ran away first. Li Xianxian thought about it and walked into the alley. As for the route or something, it would be better to ask someone later. However, she never had the opportunity again. Because she was surrounded. In the crowd, Li Xianxian saw the passerby again and immediately understood that the other person's gaze was really looking at a fool. Who sent you here? Even if I die, I have to die to understand, right? However, this group of people did not respond at all and directly raised their swords to chop towards Li Xianxian. Li Xianxian, who was powerless, tightly opened her eyes and vowed to remember the people who killed her, but in her mind she shouted, "Help the system." 717 is also a bit panicked at this moment. "Stay, host, wait." Li Xianxian heard the sound of flipping through books in her mind, almost getting angry on the spot. Almost at the same time, a sword suddenly came sideways and with just one strike, it lifted all the weapons in front of Li Xianxian. Li Xianxian immediately took 2 steps back. Upon closer inspection, it turned out to be Xuanxuan's servant. Realizing that the newcomer could be considered as a friend rather than an enemy rear, Li Xianxian stopped thinking and immediately turned around and ran back. At this point, the only thing she can do is not to hold back. Li Xianxian wanted to run back to the main road. There were many people there, so it was not only safe, but maybe she could also call for help. However, before she could run a few steps, suddenly a person came out from the side to block her. Surprisingly, he is still Xuanxuan's servant. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Kidnapping. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Kidnapping. Xuanxuan's eyes lit up in an instant. You go help me quickly. Xuanxuan pointed back as she spoke, but before she could finish speaking and turn around, her neck suddenly hurt. Her eyes turned black, and she immediately fell into a coma. When Xuanxuan was about to let go of his hands and feet, he heard Xuanxuan's voice from behind. He turned around and saw Li Si slapping Xuanxuan. Li Si. What are you doing? Li Si snorted lightly and said, do you still have time to worry about others? Are you worried about your master? Upon hearing this, Xuanxuan immediately widened his eyes and raised his sword, angrily saying, what do you mean? What's wrong with the master? Please explain it to me clearly. However, after Li Si finished speaking, he had already dragged Xuanxuan away. Xuanxuan wanted to catch up, but was also surrounded by that group of people and couldn't get away from her. In no time, the whistle sounded and the group of people also retreated in an instant. Xuanxuan stood still, thought about it, then turned around and ran towards the inn where his master was located. Xuanxuan opened her eyes again and was awakened by the jolt of the carriage. She was the only one inside the carriage. But her hands and feet were tied and thrown directly onto the carriage. No wonder it's so bumpy. Xuanxuan propped herself up on the side of the car with her elbow, and then leaned against the edge of the seat, successfully allowing herself to sit on the soft cushion. Looking at her bound hands, she hesitated and decided to use her good teeth to untie it. However, although the rope was thick, it wrapped around many circles, and with occasional people flipping over the curtains to check outside, Xuanxuan's solution was not very smooth. She patiently untied the rope while pondering in her mind. Who could have kidnapped her? The original owner had a simple social life and had no other contact except for the Xia and Li families. Today at the Li mansion, she had already cancelled her engagement according to Li Guangping's wishes, except for not providing engagement tokens. But when she left the Li mansion, the medicinal powder she sprinkled was enough to make the mansion chaotic. How could she still spare no effort to catch her? Apart from the Li family, there is only the Qin family. Xuanxuan's speculation was verified when she was escorted off the carriage. In addition to two simple carriages on the field, there is also a super luxury version of the carriage parked in the middle. Xuanxuan didn't have time to take a closer look at its luxury, only to see a golden depiction of the character, Qin, on the carriage. There were about 10 people standing on each side of the carriage, and a group of people gathered in a grand circle, as if blocking someone. Xuanxuan only recognized this place when she was pushed forward and about to stand in front of the luxurious carriage. It's the Broken Head Cliff. Unlike ordinary cliffs, the path to the top of the Duantou Cliff is exceptionally wide and gentle, which can be reached by carriage. However, on the other side of the cliff, it is almost vertical and the depth below the cliff is not bottomless. It is said that this place was formed by a cultivator cutting open the ground with a sword and then lifting it up. However, regardless of the cause, just looking at this place being named Duantou Cliff is enough to see its danger. At least based on the memories of the original owner in recent years, they have never seen any survivors of falling off the cliff. With this in mind, Xuanxuan happened to stand still. In the next moment, after seeing the other side clearly, she couldn't help but take a deep breath. To alert the world, a chivalrous man erected a stone higher than a human on the cliff, on which the three characters, cliff, were carved with weapons. At this moment, the stone was wrapped in a thick rope, with both ends of the rope pulled to the edge of the cliff and tied to a wheelchair, which was already half suspended. Above it, it is Xuanxuan. At this moment, a young master in brocade stepped down from the luxurious carriage. As soon as he came out, he threw a bundle at Xuanxuan and said, "Tell me, where is the jade cicada hairpin?" Not to mention it, the young master pointed to the cliff. "That's your fate." Xuanxuan looked at the scattered bundle under her feet, even the things in her makeup box rolling out. She couldn't help but feel grateful that when she saw Xuanxuan carefully put away the jade pendant, she chose to hide the hairpin close to her body. However, she's so easy to guess. There is limited space to hide, including the Li mansion, the bundle, and herself. In the silence of Li Xianxian, a woman walked out of another simple carriage, dressed in a pink dress, with a double bun and willow leaf eyebrows, highlighting her apricot eyes. Sister. Did you tamper with the food served to the nobles in the mansion? The young master in the imperial robe snorted coldly, either she or he, neither of them can be separated from each other. Upon hearing this, the woman bowed to Prince Genie and said, Cici Dai's sister apologizes to Prince Qin and asks him to forgive her for being influenced by others. The young master in brocade quickly grabbed the woman's hand and helped her up, saying, It's easy to say. It's easy to say. Upon hearing this, how could Li Xianxian not know their identities? The man is the young master of the Qin family, Qin Chao, the female is Li Guangping's daughter, Li Cici. Li Xianxian lowered her head and didn't look at the two of them looking sticky. At this moment, a heavy and long hum suddenly came from the luxurious carriage, which shook Qin Chao to immediately release Li Cici's hands, straighten his body, and solemnly say, Cici, go search her body, I'm in charge of someone surnamed Xie. Qin Chao said so, but even though Xuanxuan was tied up, he still brought his two subordinates with him, and they were still several meters away, so he stopped. Xuanxuan, I advise you to obediently take out the orchid jade pendant. Otherwise, your little wife will go over and accompany you. Due to half of the wheelchair being suspended, it is impossible to maintain balance, and a normal person sitting on it will only move backwards uncontrollably. But Xuanxuan still stood tall like a pine tree, and his face remained unshakable. After hearing Qin Chao's words, he calmly retorted in his voice. We have already withdrawn our marriage. Qin Chao, on the other hand, paid no attention and said, What if we get divorced? Even if you quit, wouldn't you just obediently come with us as soon as you hear she's in our hands? Qin Chao spoke extremely loudly, with a hint of mockery in his words. Upon hearing these words, Li Xianxian couldn't help but turn her head to look at Xuanxuan not far away. The other person seemed to feel something and also glanced at her, but quickly withdrew it. Sister, life and death are on the brink of death. Do you still have time to flirt here? Li Xianxian looked straight at Li Cici in front of her and asked somewhat puzzled, Do the Li family also want to admire the Qin family's breath now? Upon hearing this, Li Cici's lips showed a hint of mockery. She lowered her voice and said, Although my sister lives in Zhuangzi all year round, is it difficult? I don't even know about the slightest disturbance in Qinghe City. Li Xianxian frowned and said, How could the Qin family be so powerful? After Li Cici chuckled twice, she said impatiently, Sister, let's hand over the hairpin. Otherwise, the entire Li family will have to bury you. How do you know that after handing over the hairpin, we can be safe and sound? Although Li Xianxian didn't know the full picture yet, she had an intuition that with the jade cicada hairpin, they would still be fine. However, once they handed over the hairpin, they were afraid that the Li family would be useless with the Qin family. Li Cici can't see clearly, can't Li Guangping also see clearly? End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Falling off a cliff. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5 Falling off a cliff. Before Li Xianxian could think about it again, Li Cici had already taken direct action and attempted to search for Li Xuanxuan's body. This may not be a good time, but Li Xianxian couldn't do it either. She had to pull her hands out of the rope and quickly tied Li Cici up. Li Cici widened her eyes in shock. She never expected that Li Xianxian could untie the rope in an instant and tie her up. Can you say? Li Cici was so surprised that she only opened her mouth and forgot to make a sound, but the Qin family guard beside her was not a pillar. Just as they approached, Li Xianxian had already bent down to pick up the medicine bottles scattered on the ground. At this moment, she didn't care what the medicinal effects were, just closed her eyes, held her breath, opened them all at once, and sprayed them on the people rushing towards her. After sprinkling, she ran while still throwing the bottle at the person who wanted to pursue her. Run! Hurry up and run! The only thought in Xuanxuan's mind was to run towards the lower cliff road. The medicine bottles of the original owner were all given by Xuanxuan before. The medicine of cultivators is naturally the best, even if you don't look back, just the constant cries of pain from behind can be seen. However, in the next moment, a strong gust of wind suddenly hit Xuanxuan and swept her up to the edge of the cliff. Xuanxuan's hands were tightly gripping the ground, not daring to relax at all. Because she could feel that her feet seemed to be suspended. A person who cultivates immortals. How could there be cultivators in Qinghe City? When Xuanxuan was forced to retreat, she did not fail to observe others. She was the only one on the field controlled by the strange wind, not caused by the cultivator. Who could it be? Qin Chao couldn't help but burst out laughing when he saw Xuanxuan's embarrassed appearance. Couples are birds in the same forest, flying separately in the face of great difficulties. Qin Chao turned to Xuanxuan and mocked, "It seems that you, this little wife, don't care about you." Xuanxuan did not respond. But Xuanxuan didn't pay attention either. She was trying her best to climb forward, and when she got further away from the edge of the cliff, she quickly stood up and took 2 more steps outside before stopping. It's not that she doesn't want to continue, but to move forward, it's Qin Chao and the others. Qin Chao saw her like this and was about to say a few more words when suddenly a deep and hoarse voice with a hint of authority came from behind. "Hand over the jade pendant and hairpin, spare you from dying." Xuanxuan looked at the luxurious carriage in the distance, thinking that the cultivator was hiding there. Just as Xuanxuan didn't know what to do, Xuanxuan next to her suddenly spoke up. "Hairpin, are you still there?" Xuanxuan hesitated for a moment and nodded. "Give it to me, I'll take you away." After hesitating for a moment, Xuanxuan suddenly smiled and said, "Xuanxuan, do you think I'm stupid?" Xuanxuan. Not speaking is default. Xuanxuan couldn't help but snort coldly, but she restrained herself and asked in reverse, "Where's the jade pendant?" "It's still on you too." This time, Xuanxuan nodded. As the two were talking, Qin Chao also waved his hand. 20 or so Qin family guards behind him immediately drew their swords and, holding them up, surrounded the two on the edge of the cliff. Qin Chao saw that the guard had arrived by his side and his confidence grew stronger. He immediately spoke loudly, "You too. Those who are sensible should quickly hand over your things. Otherwise, we'll force a search." Xuanxuan was curious and said, "Aren't you afraid that we'll jump down? Someone will destroy the jade." Upon hearing these words, Qin Chao burst into laughter and said, "Jokes. Since we dare to bring you up, we are naturally not afraid." As if to verify what he said, a gust of wind suddenly blew behind Xuanxuan, not as strong as before, but also causing her to lean forward. Xuanxuan's face immediately froze. 717, I remember you said, the secret to the male lead falling off a cliff and not dying. Yes, Xuanxuan turned her head to look at Xuanxuan and found that he was not only in a wheelchair, but also bound with both hands, and managed to escape with just one foot. Sensing Xuanxuan's gaze, Xuanxuan looked back at her. Although he remained silent, his expression seemed to prompt her to consider what he had said earlier. Xuanxuan raised the corner of her mouth and said, "You don't need to help me. Let me help you." As Xuanxuan's words fell, everything that followed seemed to have been slowed down. I saw a woman dressed elegantly spinning towards the edge of the cliff, but after 2 laps, she was already close. In the next lap, 2 thick ropes silently broke. She was like a moth to the fire, throwing herself into the embrace of the person sitting in the wheelchair, who seemed to be a legitimate immortal. The hem of their clothes fluttered in the wind. Suddenly, A snap sound rang out, and the two of them, along with their wheelchairs, moved back together, falling down. Everyone was shocked and instinctively moved forward. At this moment, something was thrown up, and under the illumination of light, it became incredibly transparent. Someone saw it and said in surprise, "Is that a jade pendant?" As soon as these words were spoken, everyone couldn't help but lift their heads and gather their footsteps towards the place where the item was about to fall. Fool. It was the deep and hoarse voice from before. In the next moment, a group of guards, along with Qin Chao, were all blown back to the side of the carriage by a strong wind. The crowd fell 7 times and 8 times crooked, and suddenly there were cries of sorrow. Especially Qin Chao, his mouth was full of curses. Li Sisi was tied up and stayed by the carriage, so when the sound reappeared, she immediately turned her head to look. I saw a person standing out from the luxurious carriage, dressed in a grey Taoist robe, with white hair on his head, and a face as smooth and seamless as a teenager. Li Sisi suddenly stiffened all over. Although the person did not look at her, Li Sisi could sense that he had glanced at her with his spare light. With just one glance, she felt like she was being targeted by a venomous snake. Fortunately, his attention is not here. Li Sisi suppressed her fear and followed the other person's gaze. Is it the item that was originally suspected to be a jade pendant? Is it glowing? Without waiting for Li Sisi to think again, the object began to fall due to the wind and touched the ground. Bang. A loud bang. The crowd was swept away by the strong wind and not affected, but the explosive heat wave still swept towards them. Everyone couldn't help but panic and retreat. The young man with white hair still stood motionless in front of the carriage, and then he looked at Qin Chao, rebuking him in a low voice. "Fool! You can see clearly this time." Qin Chao turned his head at the sound and his gaze touched the white-haired boy. He couldn't help but shrink his neck and didn't dare to say a word. The white-haired boy quickly looked back at the cliff. His gaze seemed to fall on the large pit that had appeared due to the explosion, or on the space outside the cliff. Soon, everyone heard him angrily curse. "Vertical sun, damn it. Take me to the bottom of the cliff to search. Live to see people, die to see corpses." End of this chapter. Chapter 6. One person. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. One person. After the white-haired boy finished speaking, he threw the curtain back into the carriage, and the coachman quickly drove the carriage away. Qin Chao secretly complained. The last 2 sentences were clearly meant for him, but where can we get into the bottom of the broken head cliff? Isn't this making things difficult for him? Unfortunately, he can't ignore it. Qin Chao waved helplessly, gesturing for everyone to follow the carriage ahead and prepare to leave the cliff first. After taking 2 steps, he suddenly saw Li Sisi and raised his hand to greet her, "Miss Sisi." Then he ran over to untie Li Sisi. After the guards of the Qin family glanced at each other, they didn't bother to go over. Afterwards, the 2 of them did not get on the carriage, but followed behind. Although they fell far away, they seemed to be talking intimately when they got close. The guards ignored them and continued walking towards the cliff. After everyone left, the broken head cliff calmed down for about a cup of tea. Then, for no reason, a wind rose on the cliff, so strong that it rolled up sand and stones on the ground, and the sky suddenly became blurry. After half a sound, the wind stopped and sand and stones fell. The ground on the cliff edge has been restored to a flat surface, with no more traces of large pits. This is Li Xuanxuan's 3rd time opening her eyes today, but her treatment is getting worse and worse. This time, she woke up in pain. Li Xuanxuan wanted to touch her painful left hand, but before her right hand could be lifted, a strange sensation came from her palm, and she couldn't help but look down. Ah! It's a skull. Li Xuanxuan was startled, quickly withdrew her hand, and stood up. However, her gaze shifted and she found that the ground was covered with bones. She couldn't help but take 2 steps back. Li Xianxian looked up and found that there was already a thick fog in mid-air, and even the surrounding area not far away was white. Isn't this the bottom of the cliff? When packing her luggage, Li Xianxian noticed that the other end of the jade cicada hairpin was incredibly sharp. Although surprised, for safety and collection reasons, she chose to keep it close to her body and it came in handy. As for what Qin Chao said, Li Xianxian did not believe it. And what Xuanxuan said later also confirmed Li Xuanxuan's idea. The jade cicada hairpin was strange, and Li Xianxian didn't want to let it go. However, there were cultivators ahead, and Li Xianxian didn't want to rely on anyone else. Coincidentally, the system also confirmed the male lead's aura, so she decided to take a risky move. But for now, Xuanxuan is not here, system. 717 Li Xianxian called out to the system several times in her heart, and even made a sound afterwards, but the person named 717 system never responded. Li Xianxian thought about it and was about to take a step forward to take a look when a warm yellow light suddenly appeared in front of her, and then scattered into a halo, gradually revealing the central position. Surprisingly, it's a plant of grass. A grass with 2 red fruits. Li Xianxian watched and couldn't help but take 2 steps forward, as if she wanted to observe more carefully. The next second, the halo suddenly lit up, and the surroundings turned into a white light. Li Xianxian couldn't help but want to close her eyes, but there was a previous incident and she didn't dare, afraid of another accident. In the white light, Li Xianxian couldn't see or hear anything. After an unknown amount of time, the first sound that came to her ears was a gradually clear noise, with a refreshing breeze blowing, carrying a few strands of food aroma, which also made Li Xianxian suddenly more conscious. The white light gradually faded away, and the surroundings gradually became colored. This is a long street, with shops or stalls on both sides of the street. People come and go on the street, either shouting or talking, whether it's lively or not. Li Xianxian looked left and right in confusion. She noticed that it seemed like the street she was on today in Qinghe City where she was soliciting people for questioning. Is this wearing again? Or was it reborn? Before Li Xianxian could think about it again, suddenly there was a palm behind her, slapping her vigorously. Since Li Xianxian discovered that the ground was covered with bones, she tried to tiptoe as much as possible, whether walking or standing. The palm came quickly, and without noticing, she stumbled forward several steps. At this moment, I stepped firmly on the soles of my feet and realized that the ground was covered with bluestone slabs. So, is this true? As soon as her thoughts fell, Li Xianxian, who had not yet stood firm, was startled to feel that she was about to collide with a passerby approaching her. She couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. Get out of the way! Get out of the way! However, the passers-by seemed to have never heard of her, without blinking their eyes, and walked straight towards her without stopping. I'm afraid it will hurt even more this time. Li Xianxian was howling in her heart, but in the next moment, she watched helplessly as she penetrated through the passers-by. Li Xianxian stopped and turned back in shock. Before she could ask any questions, another group of people passed through her. She lowered her head and looked at her own hands, then tried to touch others and speak up. Sure enough, she can't touch it. No one else can hear it. Has this become a ghost? Even with the body that was still in pain just now, there is nothing unusual about it. Li Xianxian was about to explore further when an invisible barrier blocked her. Then, her body uncontrollably retreated until it stopped behind a pair of masters and servants. Miss, are we really going to see that young master? The maid in a double bun asked anxiously. In front of the maidservant, there was a woman in a white dress, embroidered with red peony flowers on her clothes, and covered with a layer of thin gauze outside. However, even so, it was difficult to conceal her graceful figure. Soon, a soft female voice sounded, I'm going. Then, we must go and return early. Otherwise, let the master know again and he will definitely kill me. The maid was very worried. The young lady chuckled lightly and said, Don't worry, I will definitely protect you." Upon hearing the young lady's promise, the maid's worries dissipated, and she only nodded happily. The master and servant walked as they spoke, and Li Xianxian was forced to follow behind. Just as she wanted to take a quick 2 steps and take a look at their faces, a click sound rang out. The street has turned into a room. Li Xianxian watched helplessly as the scene in front of her changed her outfit in a second, while she also changed from standing to sitting. Even though she was slow, Li Xianxian could see the eerie environment she was in. This must be the means of cultivators. I just don't know how to get out of here. What about Xuanxuan who fell to the bottom of the cliff with her? Has he also followed in? After thinking alone for a while, Li Xianxian withdrew her thoughts and decided to focus on the present moment first. After all, she can't be too far away from this master and servant now. Upon this thought, Li Xuanxuan's gaze naturally fell back on the two of them. The maid's height is not high, and her appearance is also ordinary. Perhaps she is still young, with baby fat on her cheeks. Paired with 2 buns, she is also cute. Looking at the young lady sitting upright again, I saw her gentle and kind face. Although her overall facial features were not outstanding, upon closer inspection, her eyebrows and eyes were delicate and charming. Against the backdrop of her white clothes, she had black hair and snowy skin, which was very eye-catching. The new book season requires the support of friends very much. We are seeking more votes and 5-star book reviews. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Fantasy. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7 Fantasy. With such 2 women accompanying her, Li Xianxian was not bored either. In addition, Li Xianxian discovered that she could also receive an illusory portion of the food here. For example, when she picked up a piece of pastry on this table, the quantity on the plate did not change, but when she ate it, both the taste and texture were no different from reality. Isn't it enjoyable to eat like this without gaining weight? Although there is no storyteller in this inn, the windows in the room are facing the street, and looking down from upstairs to see people coming and going is the most suitable way to consume time. But even so, Li Xianxian didn't expect to wait for so long. Among the 3, the servant girl who was called Banksia by the young lady was the first to be agitated. She kept walking back and forth and asked from time to time, "Are you thirsty, young lady? Are you hungry?" She tried to sneak out when she went to order a pot of tea or dim sum. Li Xianxian originally intended to follow along, but, as expected, she couldn't stay too far away from the person. It was Mississippi. However, Banksia couldn't leave the inn either. Later, she directly advised, "Miss, why don't I go and urge you? Or maybe I can find a waiter to run errands. Or, Miss, why don't we go back first? If it's too late, the master will find out." No matter what Banksia said, the young lady calmly comforted her and occasionally made excuses for that young master. Li Xianxian saw it and really admired it. After waiting for about an hour, the door of the room was finally knocked on. Banksia quickly ran over to open the door, and Li Xianxian, who was sitting by the window, also turned her head. Her gaze was tightly locked at the door. The visitor was also dressed in a white dress, embroidered with plum blossoms on their clothes, and holding a plum blossom fan in their hand. Their facial features were very ordinary, relying solely on their height and clothing to support them like a human. Cough cough. Li Xianxian was about to turn her gaze back to the window when she noticed a figure closely following the young master into the room. She fixed her eyes on it. "Thank you, Xuanxuan." Li Xianxian immediately stood up and walked over quickly. "Did you come in too?" Xuanxuan nodded as he waited for someone to follow him. In fact, at the moment he opened the door, he found Li Xianxian, but Li Xianxian kept looking at Xuangwen and didn't see him immediately. Li Xianxian was somewhat happy to see Xuanxuan. After all, she doesn't understand the methods of cultivators, and relying on her own words, it may be quite difficult to get out. "Do you know how to get out?" Li Xianxian looked at Xuanxuan with bright eyes, and Xuanxuan didn't hide anything. He nodded and said, I know, but it's not yet time. This statement made Li Xuanxuan's heart go up and down. Before Li Xianxian could ask again, she saw Xuanxuan turn his head to look beside him, and she followed suit to look over. The three people in the room surprisingly stood still. Xuanxuan spoke calmly and said, this is a secret realm constructed by illusion techniques. There are two ways to weave this secret realm. One is based on the memory of the entrant, and the other is based on the memory of the controller. The former usually selects the most painful or sweet things in the immigrants' memories for reproduction. Once the immigrants lose themselves in it, they will forever sink into the secret realm. On the contrary, as long as they persist in their state of mind until the scene ends, they can naturally leave the secret realm. As for the latter, Li Xianxian stopped before Xuanxuan could finish speaking, pondered for a moment, and replied, are we in the second and more difficult mode? Xuanxuan nodded and said, in the secret realm woven by the controller, we can only follow the predetermined people in the realm and experience an infinite number of scenes. Until the target scene appears, we will gain control of the people's bodies in the realm. At this time, the choices we make will determine the success or failure of our exit. Li Xianxian. Isn't it the border controller who decides the success or failure? Xuanxuan pondered for a moment and said, not really. Normally, when weaving in the secret realm, the answer is already determined, so we need to carefully observe each scene. Li Xianxian nodded at the words and said, so why are they doing this? She pointed to the other three people still in the room. Xuanxuan saw that Li Xianxian had already shifted his attention, so he didn't say anything more. Anyway, there is not only one way to crack this secret realm. Because the controller paused the scene. Why? Xuanxuan's eyebrows twitched slightly and he asked in response, do you think we can still hear what they are saying when we talk like this? Li Xianxian was puzzled, why not? Xuanxuan choked and realized later. Yes, she has always been good at dual purposes. Xuanxuan suddenly fell silent, and Li Xianxian didn't care either. She just muttered to herself, I didn't expect this situation controller to be so kind. Who knew, as soon as the words fell, the scene began to move. Sure enough, this person is not worth reciting. Li Xianxian had just let go of this thought when a white light flashed through her mind. Suddenly, she turned back to look at Xuanxuan in surprise and asked with her mouth. Is he also here? After reading the information, Xuanxuan nodded in admiration. Li Xianxian immediately approached and whispered, then let's find him and break through from him, okay? It's possible, but it's not that easy to find the controller. Li Xianxian frowned lightly, but she didn't speak anymore because Xuanxuan had already instructed her to observe the scene first. When the scene began to run, Li Xianxian was not distracted and didn't come and go without some pleasantries, which were not very nutritious. On the contrary, she knew from Xuanxuan that the young master's name had a single, Kuei, character. Oh, it's not entirely without information. For example, the lady's name was originally called Xiaoyao and she was the richest daughter in this city. For example, the acquaintance between the two originated from a hero saving the beauty, and this meeting is a medicinal herb that Miss Xiaoyao is preparing to give to Duan Kuei for recuperation. After standing and talking for a while, the two sat at the round table after being reminded by Banksia. Li Xianxian quickly followed over and, before pouring tea in midsummer, took out an imaginary portion of each of the 2 teacups and teapots. Although she only got along for a few hours, Li Xianxian knew that Banksia was very careful. For example, when Duan Kuei entered the door, she had already told the waiter to serve new tea and dim sum. Come here. Li Xianxian greeted Xuanxuan, then picked up the teapot and poured the 2 cups until they were 7/10 full. Without waiting for Xuanxuan to come over, she picked up her own cup, sniffed it carefully first, then leaned closer to her mouth and took a sip. The tea has a strong aroma, a mellow and sweet taste, and is a good tea. When Xuanxuan stood still, he happened to see Li Xianxian with a satisfied expression on her face. On the one hand, he was surprised by her discovery. After all, the operation of taking out illusory food was something that even someone who had experienced a scene had not noticed. On the other hand, it was also funny that she placed her sensitivity in such a place. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Broken Scum Man. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Broken Scum Man. Xuanxuan lifted his robe and sat down upright. He slowly reached out his hand, put on a teacup, gently wiped the body of the cup with his thumb and fingertips, then took it to his mouth and drank slowly. The whole movement was calm and elegant, very eye-catching. Li Xianxian watched up close and was very satisfied. She was about to put down her teacup and add another one for Xuanxuan when Duan Kuei's voice came to her ear. Miss Xiaoyao, I'm really sorry for being late today. It's really unfortunate that the old lady who fainted on the way is so pitiful. It's amazing that nowadays, people are indifferent and no one can lend a helping hand. But now that I've seen this, I can't bear it in any way. However, whether I walked a full 10 miles behind my grandmother's back, or stayed by the bed guarding her for half an hour, it's not the reason why I was late. Duan Kuei suddenly stood up, clasped his hands, and bowed to Xiaoyao. Miss Xiaoyao, can you forgive me for this? Xiaoyao was startled by Duan Kuei's sudden action and quickly stood up. Just as she reached out to help Duan Kuei up, Li Xianxian couldn't help but suddenly put down the teacup in her hand. Scumbag, full of nonsense. Xuanxuan saw a momentary pause in the scene, and a hint of contemplation flashed in his eyes. He then interjected. Why do you say that? Li Xianxian had already stood up and pointed at Duan Kuei, walking over and saying. An adult man walks 10 kilometers and still needs an hour, let alone carrying an old man on his back. He travels 20 kilometers and has half an hour to take care of him in between. Even if he arrives early for the appointment and doesn't stop in the middle, that time won't match. Since the afternoon has passed, could it be that he had already gone out by sunrise? And his breath is steady, whether it's his face or clothes, clean and tidy. What is the appearance of a person who has carried people and moved? Don't say that he went home to tidy up a bit, it's still that sentence. Time is not up. One more thing. Li Xianxian stood still and glared at Duan Kuei in front of her. He still has the smell of rouge on his body. She smelled it. He must have gone to see another girl. Li Xianxian turned to look at Xuanxuan and said, am I right? Xuanxuan, like her, cannot be too far away from the established people in the environment, so it is possible for him to see them. Xuanxuan has always disdained lying, especially in such cases. Before departure, Duan Kuei did indeed procrastinate. Seeing that the agreed time had passed, he slowly left. Thinking of this, Xuanxuan looked up at Li Xianxian. This person hates being punctual the most. Xuanxuan withdrew his gaze and spoke calmly. After Duan Kuei went out, he did indeed encounter someone who fainted, but it was not Grandma, but Flower Girl from Xinghua Tower. As soon as Xuanxuan finished speaking, Li Xianxian immediately took up the conversation and cursed at Duan Kuei. Scumbag, full of lies. After Li Xianxian finished cursing, although she knew that Xiaoyao couldn't hear her, she still said to her, look. This person can't handle it. Unfortunately, the miracle did not occur. Xiaoyao not only expressed understanding, but also greatly admired Duan Kuei's behavior. Moreover, their acquaintance was also due to Duan Kuei's willingness to help others, so Xiaoyao believed that this was his personal charm. Li Xianxian. Li Xianxian, who was unable to complain, tried to roll her eyes and sat down at the round table again. Then, she looked at the peony and asked Banksia to give a pile of precious medicinal herbs to Duan Kuei, listening to Xiaoyao's blushing expression expressing gratitude to Duan Kuei. Finally, because Duan Kuei was in a hurry to come over for the appointment after seeing off his grandmother. Xiaoyao was worried that he hadn't eaten lunch, so he ordered a large table of delicious food. As a result, it fell into Li Xuanxuan's mouth. Although Li Xianxian ate the imaginary portion, Duan Kuei didn't eat much either. It wasn't that the food didn't suit his taste, but that he had already eaten it at the Apricot Blossom Tower. After learning the reason from Xuanxuan, Li Xianxian cursed at Duan Kuei again as a scumbag. Xuanxuan saw Li Xianxian mention it 3 times. Although he could guess that it was not a good idea, with a spirit of not being ashamed to ask, he still asked. "What is a scumbag?" Upon hearing these words, Li Xianxian immediately widened her eyes and replied, "Men are divided into good and bad. The worst is the lack of proper values, while this scumbag is the worst of all. The worst is his character. He is extremely selfish and only knows how to take things, but is not responsible. He is the worst man who only plays with others' emotions." Xuanxuan listened carefully and then nodded in agreement. Li Xianxian couldn't help but feel a little relieved when she saw that he could hear. Just in the next moment, I remembered his group of 3,000 beauties in the future, and my heart couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy. But on second thought, things haven't happened yet, and she can't be too arbitrary. Just as Li Xianxian was trying to dissuade Xuanxuan from learning from Duan Kuei in the future, Xuanxuan suddenly confronted Li Xianxian. "I'm not a scumbag." Li Xianxian immediately froze. Thinking to himself, how does he know what she's thinking in her heart? But is he a scumbag? He has nothing to do with her now. What do you want her to do? Li Xianxian nodded nonchalantly, and Xuanxuan didn't know if he noticed her perfunctory behavior. With a heavy gaze, he suddenly asked. "Are women also classified in this way?" Li Xianxian didn't think deeply and casually replied, "Both men and women are." After speaking, she realized, "Why do you ask that?" "It's nothing," Xuanxuan said in a gentle tone. Li Xianxian. Before Li Xianxian could further investigate, Banxia on the other side had already spoken out to remind Xiaoyao, "Miss, it's getting late. If you don't leave again, you will really be discovered by the master." Upon hearing this, Xiaoyao stood up and bid farewell to Duan Kuei, while Li Xianxian also stood up, preparing to follow Xiaoyao into the next scene. However, she never expected that as it came to an end, Duan Kuei would once again refresh her understanding. "Miss Xiaoyao, to be honest with you, I have spent all my silver on my body to help grandma before. Now." Before Duan Kuei could finish speaking, Xiaoyao couldn't bear it anymore and quickly said, "Today is when I invited Mr. Duan, so naturally I should be the host to treat him. Moreover, Mr. Duan only met his grandmother to attend the meeting." Xiaoyao felt guilty for not being able to help at that time, and now he can only stick it with silver. "Please don't mind, Mr. Duan." After Xiaoyao finished speaking, he not only asked Banxia to pay the bill, but also asked her to give Duan Kuei a silver receipt. After tapping his palm twice with a plum blossom fan, Duan Kuei reluctantly accepted it. "For now, I can only follow Miss Xiaoyao's advice, but please invite me again next time," he said. Upon hearing these words, Xiaoyao thought that the two could see each other again, and a shy expression couldn't help but appear in her face and eyes. She just lowered her head as a gesture of goodwill. Upon seeing this, Duan Kuei satisfactorily unfolded the plum blossom fan and shook it. Li Xianxian watched from the side, already so angry that she couldn't even curse a scumbag. Banxia quickly finished paying the bill and returned. The group was preparing to leave the room, with Li Xianxian lagging behind. By the time she stepped out of the room, the others had already walked to the lobby on the first floor. Li Xianxian sighed and was about to step down the stairs when Yu Guang saw Xuanxuan downstairs also looking at her. Just as she was wondering, she suddenly realized something and couldn't help but, Looking for recommendation tickets, monthly tickets, and 5-star book reviews. Friends, come to the Peach Bowl now. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. People in the Realm. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9 People in the Realm. Thank you, Xuanxuan. After shouting loudly, Li Xianxian ran downstairs with a faint smile in Xuanxuan's eyes as the scene was paused again. The controller knows that Li Xianxian can be dual-use and theoretically wouldn't pause the scene anymore, but now it still stops. Lenovo's previous scene also experienced a momentary pause. Xuanxuan speculates, he was frightened. Thank you, Xuanxuan. Li Xianxian ran all the way to Xuanxuan, both in expression and tone, with great surprise. Can you stand now? Xuanxuan withdrew his gaze from scanning the three people next to him and turned to look at Li Xianxian in front of him. He saw that her eyes were wrinkled and bright, and her right hand was hidden under her wide sleeve. His index finger couldn't help but move slightly, but there was still no significant change in her face, only a gentle Li Xianxian was actually very happy. She walked into this world and heard his voice before seeing anyone. Although he was the male lead and she was cannon fodder, setting aside this, it was really a pity that such a beautiful person had to ride in a wheelchair. Xuanxuan felt a bit complicated when he saw Li Xianxian looking like she had seen a miracle. He was unable to walk due to injury, not born disabled, so in the secret realm, he exists in the form of a soul. Naturally walking is no different, but in reality, his body is still not good, and even worse now. But right now, seeing Li Xianxian so happy, especially her sincere eyes, without any distractions, Xuanxuan didn't reveal anything. With another click sound, the scene changed again. The inn turned into a valley mansion, and the hall became a boudoir. The sky outside was already dark and the environment was completely different from before, but Li Xuanxuan's emotions were still in the previous second of happiness. So she didn't pay attention to the people in her established environment and went out, walking around freely within the range of activities. Li Xianxian has only been to 2 mansions so far, Li Mansion and Gu Mansion. At present, she can only go as far as the entrance of the courtyard, so it is unclear whether it is the unique courtyard of Xiaoyao or the entire Gu Mansion, but at least this courtyard is much more luxurious than the entire Li Mansion. Just as Li Xianxian finished strolling and wanted to go back, a pair of male servants arrived outside the yard. The two of them stood in front of the door, one behind the other, without saying a word. They stood silently for about a quarter of an hour before leaving quietly. Li Xianxian walked back to her room and happened to hear Banxia saying to Xiaoyao, "Miss, the master has come over again tonight." So that person is the father of Xiaoyao. For what Banxia said, Xiaoyao seemed to have never heard of it, only focusing on her needlework. Seeing this, Li Xianxian became a little angry again because she was embroidering a purse, with a navy blue color and plum blossom patterns. It looked like she was going to give it to that scumbag, Duan Kuei. Banxia's reaction to her young lady was not surprising, but she couldn't help but say a few more words for the master. "Miss, the master didn't mean not to go that day. Isn't this all for saving people?" "Most likely, this is not the first time I have said it," and the peony is completely unmoved. Banxia reluctantly closed her mouth and stood up, looking at the purse that the young lady was embroidering. Thinking about the young lady's value for Duan Gongzi, she couldn't help but think of a new way. "Miss, if it weren't for the master being tripped up at the time, you wouldn't have met Mr. Duan, would you? Why don't you look at him?" "Nonsense." Xiaoyao's face showed a hint of annoyance. "Mr. Duan has a chivalrous heart. He can even do his best to help an unfamiliar grandmother on the roadside. Even if it weren't me that day, if it were someone else, he would have come to his rescue. Mr. Duan's enthusiasm is not to cover up his despicable behavior of breaking his promise and disregarding his mother's taboo for the day." The sound of this accusation, the more Xiaoyao spoke, the sharper it became, and the more it spoke, the more desolate it became. After speaking, her chest was already heaving violently, and her figure paused. Banxia was frightened a lot and quickly stepped forward to help her, coaxing her repeatedly, "All right, miss. If Banxia doesn't say anything, please calm down." Banksia patted the back of Xiaoyao while trying to help her sit down at the table, but at this moment, Xiaoyao didn't forget to ask Banksia to put the embroidery on her hand first. Li Xianxian, who had been silently watching, said, After waiting for the peony to recover, Banksia served her again to wash and sleep. Li Xianxian thought this scene would end soon like the first two, but she waited left and right, unable to hear the click sound. In the end, she was so tired that she fell asleep on the table. After she fell asleep, the peony on the bed and Banksia in the outer room suddenly opened their eyes, got up, got out of bed, and walked out of the room one by one. If there were anyone here, careful observation would reveal that the eyes of the master and servant were empty and lifeless, and their walking movements were also very stiff. Unfortunately, at this moment, the vast courtyard is empty. Li Xianxian woke up the next day, feeling excruciating pain in her neck and arms from sleeping on her stomach. It wasn't until she had breakfast and lunch with Peony that she felt a slight relief. And for several consecutive days, the scene continued in the Valley Mansion. Li Xianxian looked at the Peony that had just finished her meal and then picked up the needle and thread basket. She couldn't help but lightly pat her forehead. It seemed that this scene was about to end, and she had to wait until the peony embroidered this purse. Because she couldn't be too far away from the peony, she had already grown tired of strolling in this courtyard. Li Xianxian had no choice but to lie on the low mound next to her, bored as she watched the peony embroidery. Why do you have to work so hard and painstakingly to complete an embroidery for a man who has only met twice, or a scumbag? He doesn't deserve it, wouldn't it be better to give it to himself instead? As no one heard her, Li Xianxian muttered to herself to Xiaoyao, your father, too. Everyone else ranks before their family. He is a good doctor, but not a good husband or father. And you also met a scumbag. How sad would he be if he found out in the future? Such a precious daughter, yet she will be deceived by others. Oh my! Did you get it in your hand? Li Xianxian couldn't help but shake her head when she saw the peony accidentally pricking her finger and the blood droplets sprouting from her fingertips instantly staining the fabric. However, due to the color of the fabric, it was difficult to detect. I don't know if this navy blue was chosen right or wrong. No one could answer Li Xuanxuan's doubts, so Xiaoyao put her finger in her mouth and sucked on it before continuing to embroider. In such a state of forgetfulness, one afternoon, the purse was finally embroidered. Xiaoyao rushed to write a letter to Duan Kuei before it got dark, inviting him to go out and see him tomorrow. As soon as the letter was sent out, the long-lost click sound came again. When Li Xuanxuan's gaze refocused, Xuanxuan had already sat next to her. After a few days of absence, Xuanxuan seemed to have turned a little whiter and looked even more immortal. Li Xianxian greeted him excitedly and said, Xuanxuan, I found a clue. There's a cover, Kaisen, end of this chapter. Chapter 10. Contextualizers. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Contextualizers. Upon hearing this, Xuanxuan raised his eyebrows and tail lightly. And Li Xianxian pointed to the scene and said, it just stopped again, didn't it? The word again is cleverly and appropriately used. Xuanxuan replied in a low voice, you have discovered it. Do you already know? After the words fell, Li Xianxian remembered the other person's former identity again and understood his composure. She then asked, do you also feel like this when you're with him? Xuanxuan shook his head and said, it's only when I'm with you. Li Xianxian immediately patted her hands and said, so, the controller of the environment is Peony. These days, her scene in the Valley Mansion has not been in vain, and she is not talking to herself in front of the Peony for no reason. It's all an experiment. I found that she would be startled by sudden actions or words, and according to the degree of fright, the scene would have corresponding long or short pauses. So, is it her? Today's scene has come to a standstill, but there has been no pause. Xuanxuan looked at the two people on the other side who were giving gifts to each other. His gaze fell on the hand of Xiaoyao holding the purse, and she seemed to pinch it hard, even her knuckles turning slightly white. Li Xianxian followed and looked over, but what she was looking at was Duan Kuei. After seeing the flower on his hand clearly, she suddenly felt a little disgusted and said, "Where did you pick it from?" Xuanxuan's thoughts froze for a moment, and then he humorously said, "I bought it at a small stall." Li Xianxian wanted to roast again. "It's not much money, is it?" "He has no money left on him." Li Xianxian was surprised and asked, "How could that happen?" "A few days ago, Banksia only gave him a silver bill with a considerable face value. Moreover, does he not have any income? Don't you have any savings either?" Regardless of the idea, Xuanxuan nodded. Li Xianxian. Where did he spend it? Li Xianxian was really curious, isn't it the apricot blossom tower from last time? Li Xuanxuan's sensitivity in certain aspects always surprises Xuanxuan. Seeing the expected nod, Li Xianxian had nothing to say to the scumbag who was stepping on two boats. Instead, another protagonist asked, "Is that girl very good looking?" Xuanxuan shook his head. When Li Xianxian was about to touch on something, she heard Xuanxuan add, "I didn't see it clearly." Li Xianxian. Aren't they unable to stay too far from the people in the established environment? For Xuanxuan, Li Xianxian is generally easy to understand. Under normal circumstances, this range is within a radius of 100 meters, but if entering a building, this range will correspondingly expand. Xuanxuan thought about it and added, if the inbound person is very resistant, they can also maintain a certain distance. So unless necessary, Xuanxuan would not have entered the same room as Duan Kuei, including last time. If it weren't for Li Xianxian not seeing him all along, he wouldn't have gone in. Li Xianxian blinked and said, "So how do you get intelligence?" Previously, when meeting at the inn, they had reached a consensus to observe their own scenes and exchange information with each other when they met again next time. Xuanxuan calmly explained, "My situation is special, usually not very far away, I can hear it all." This special refers to his cultivation of immortality in his return to the mortal realm, right? After all, it was Xuanxuan's sore spot, and Li Xianxian didn't want to poke it, so she just nodded. Xuanxuan saw that Li Xianxian had accepted this reason and was about to breathe a sigh of relief when he heard Li Xianxian ask, "So what did you hear?" Regarding this, Xuanxuan has nothing to hide. Duan Kuei bought a lot of valuable items to give to Miss Hua. Li Xianxian clearly asked what she heard, but Xuanxuan answered what she saw. However, compared to this, Li Xianxian was more curious. How could he treat that girl so well? Because Flower Girl can introduce him to cultivators. A cultivator. Li Xianxian was surprised, "Have you seen it?" Xuanxuan shook his head. But Li Xuanxuan's face was still somewhat solemn. This secret realm itself is quite difficult. If there are still cultivators, wouldn't it be upgrading to hell mode? Xuanxuan saw that Li Xuanxuan's attention had completely shifted, and he finally breathed a real sigh of relief because he couldn't learn the conversation between Duan Kuei and that flower girl. "Oh, by the way, you haven't said yet. Is this mood controller peony?" Xuanxuan retorted, "Why do you think it's her?" Li Xianxian looked at the two of them who had already given each other gifts and were discussing the ups and downs of the scene. Besides her emotional fluctuations, there is also the direction of the entire secret realm scene. Xiaoyao's mother passed away when she was young, but since Xiaoyao became sensible, every year on her mother's death day, her father has always been absent. They had agreed early this year to go to worship together, but unexpectedly, as the day approached, Xiaoyao's father still broke his promise due to the sudden arrival of a patient. Xiaoyao set off alone on time due to anger, only to encounter a villain on the way. Fortunately, he was saved by Duan Kuei, and then the girl's heart fell on him. According to Xuanxuan, Duan Kuei was already at the scene of the incident, waiting to save someone. His motive was impure, and he later wandered between the two girls. In the future, the disputes over family and love between Xiaoyao and her father, Xiaoyao, Duan Kuei, and Flower Girl, will undoubtedly be ups and downs. Perhaps a bit cold-blooded, but from Li Xuanxuan's divine perspective, this is truly in line with ancient times. Dog Blood. Classic plot segments. Among the three, Xiaoyao is most likely the protagonist, so she has no problem as a mood controller. After hearing this, Xuanxuan shook his head and said, "This can also be the story of Duan Kuei embarking on the path of cultivating immortality." Looking at it from a different perspective, it becomes another story. Li Xianxian nodded at the words, not without thinking about it, but it's still an intuition. She always feels that Peony is the controller of the environment. However, Xuanxuan made it clear in the next second. The controller in the secret realm does not necessarily have to be in his original body, nor does he necessarily have his original identity. Li Xianxian. Isn't that unsolvable? We can only wait for the target scene to arrive. Xuanxuan slightly curled his lips and said, "It's not urgent. Before that, you." Click. The sound of scene switching came without warning, and it seemed very intentional. Li Xianxian walked up to her desk and looked at the peony practicing calligraphy. She said with some frustration, "Since you've let us discuss in front of you, why are you still afraid?" Li Xianxian admits that she doesn't have this ability, so it can only be Xuanxuan. What did he just want to say? What is he planning again? Li Xianxian couldn't figure it out, but she couldn't do anything now. She had to gather her energy and wait until she met Xuanxuan again, or when the target scene appeared. Night falls faster than the target scene. On the bed, Xiaoyao looked at Li Xianxian sleeping soundly beside her and couldn't help but roll her big white eyes like she did. End of this chapter.